Hey there, friends. Are you ready to get a bit sophisticated today? We live in a world with sound, and sound impacts us in many ways. It can affect the way we behave or the way that we react to certain things. And that is true of ocean animals as well, which is a little weird to think about, but sound moves very differently between air and water. And it does, in fact, impact ocean wildlife as well. And so I have my good friend here, Sierra, and she's going to talk to us about some of the stuff that they do in their lab, looking at acoustics in the ocean and how it impacts wildlife. So hello, Sierra.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Awesome. So tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to be where you are and all of the lovely things about yourself.
Yeah. So I grew up in Arizona, which is something that we have in common. And you've probably gotten this question a lot too, but everybody always asks, how did you get into marine biology growing up in a landlocked desert state? And really, I think it was, the limited access to the ocean that really drew my curiosity and interest and intrigue towards it. And so I just was so fascinated by it and wanted to learn more about it and live near it. So I turned my career into living near the ocean and being in the ocean and studying it.
Yeah. I often answer that question the exact same way of I was able to explore the forests and the desert, but I didn't have that chance with the ocean because I didn't live anywhere near it. And so I like to say curiosity killed the cat, but it gave me a career. So here we are. So Sierra is part of the Aaron Mooney Lab at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is where I am a student. Their lab focuses on bioacoustics. So can you tell us a little bit about what your lab does and what your role is in the lab?
Yeah, I'm a research assistant in the bioacoustics lab, which is a really cool role. So I did a master's. I don't have a PhD. And so I sort of fit this role of helping with a lot of different science projects that are happening in the lab,
right?
Helping out with a lot of field work and coordinating different, science efforts. But I also get to lead some research and lead some of my own papers and stuff. So I've been very fortunate to be in this lab, and I love acoustics. It's such a cool field. So I've been very fortunate to be able to be exposed to it in so many different areas, passive acoustics, active acoustics, sound production, sound reception on animals.
Yeah. Whoa, that's so much cool stuff. Oh yeah, okay. So being a research assistant, it's kind of you're doing all of this science and it is very important and very cool, but it's not quite as much pressure as being a student, which is really nice, I bet.
Yeah, everything that I kind of do and accomplish is kind of above, what where a student, it's that's your job basically, right, to publish all these big, papers or carry out these larger studies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a cool in-between where I don't have to write grants for myself.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. So what projects are you guys up to in this lab?
What I work most on are two main projects, and one is offshore wind, particularly the construction sound impacts on animals like fish and invertebrates. And then on the other hand, I do a lot of coral reef acoustics. So they're soundscapes and using sound as a tool to improve larval settlement.
That's so cool. So let's start with this offshore wind thing. Wind farms, wind turbines, however you say it. Apparently we say this two different ways, but offshore wind and wind turbines in general are, clean energy. We're excited about clean energy. You're not pumping CO2 into the atmosphere and contributing to climate change. But that doesn't mean that there aren't effects of, these turbines or building them on the environment and the animals that live in certain environments. So that's one of the things that you're looking at, is how those wind turbines and those wind farms are affecting different wildlife in the ocean. So tell us a little bit about that.
It's really exciting that the technology has sort of developed to be able to build these offshore structures much more feasibly, and to have companies interested in initiating this sustainable energy alternative.
Yeah.
But we just need to, also understand what potential impacts for the animals that live there, and how best to mitigate these impacts, or strategically plan where to fund the development, and just to know what may happen, so we can sort of weigh the costs and benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. So building offshore wind farms includes pile driving, and that's what's producing all of this sound that's affecting some of these animals. Can you tell us exactly what is pile driving? How does that work?
Pile driving, there's a couple of techniques. The one that produces the most sound is called impact hammering. So that's when they have a pile and they're dropping a really big weight on it repeatedly. So it's like a hammer. It just drops, pushes it a little farther down, drops again. They have like a big crane and drops it in. And then there's another technique that they are starting to try and use more because it has less of a noise impact, and that would be vibratory hammering. So a whole bunch of blows, shaking it back and forth, and then it kind of vibrates into the sediment. And so in our field setup, we've got a really awesome field setup that we can test these two different pile driving techniques and put animals really close and really controlled from this pile. And so it's scaled down. It's more like a dock being piled in, but we do hire a construction company to repeatedly drop a weight onto a pile and then also vibrate it out and vibrate it back in.
Whoa, okay. So you get to kind of see almost like up close a downscaled version of this is how we install these big offshore wind things. So even if you've never like seen it kind of in person, you kind of get the effect of it on a smaller scale.
Yeah, and it's quite challenging to study animals on the real ones because there's a lot more restrictions of how close you can get, where you can put your animals. And with this, we can put them very close and then just kind of note that this is about a kilometer away from a real offshore wind farm. So the effects that we're seeing at these animals is roughly equivalent to, quite a big scale, a big swath of area.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Offshore wind. And I'd imagine too that, not to say that not all species are important, because all species are important, they play a certain role in their environment, but some species play a disproportionately larger role in their environment, like, a keystone species or something like that. Example being like the wolves in Yellowstone. And this is something that a lot of researchers and a lot of scientists are looking specifically at. How are the things that we're doing impacting different ecosystems and different wildlife, especially with clean energy? If we want to use energy that has minimal effect on the environment, we need to understand how it affects the environment. I would imagine, though, that some species might be impacted more than others, and depending on what species are the most impacted and how big of a role those species play in their ecosystem, that might influence how we go about, different policies and how we change our behavior around certain developments and things like that.
Yeah, totally. And, you talked about what role they play in their environment, but something we're also thinking about is how they play a role in human societies too.
Yeah.
Because that is, affects a lot of livelihoods and coastal communities. And it's where a lot of the funding is put towards too, is these key fishery species that, their collapse could really devastate some of our communities as well.
Yeah.
And not say they do play important roles in their environment. A lot of these, food animals, they are food for other animals and go up the food chain. That's something our lab has been looking at a lot, like fish and invertebrates that form these really important fisheries.
Right. So what animals have you guys been looking at that are impacted by the production of offshore wind farms? What are the effects that you're seeing?
It's really interesting. A lot of, these animals, people don't really think of them as being sound sensitive.
Right.
You don't think of like a scallop as being particularly receptive to sound.
Yeah. Or if you're from New England, scallops.
Yeah.
I can't. It bothers me so much. I can't. It's a scallop. Look,
it's just a scallop.
I learned how to speak in the Midwest. It's very like scallops, That's what it is. I'm sorry. If you're from New England, you're gonna hate the rest of this, but it's fine. Scallops are impacted by noise production through offshore wind farm production. Well,
yeah. And so, all these animals sort of listen in different ways or receive sound in different ways. But that low frequency component is what really affects most of them. So we've looked at squid, scallops, black sea bass, flounder, lobster.
I love flounders.
Bay scallop and sea scallops. Oh, you're going to love our new research then.
I'm so
flounder.
excited. I love flounders, little flat
I've grown
guys.
to love them.
I just like them because I know they're like their development,
They're
where like they start
crazy.
like a normal fish, like their larval stage is like a normal fish, and then one eye like moves over to the other side. And if you get it halfway through that development, you see one with like an eye on the
Wonky.
top of its head. And they're just too weird to not love.
Yeah.
So I love a flounder.
Love
but
the
anyway.
weird.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what we're kind of seeing is that like every animal is a little different and it requires different ways of studying it and the response is different. And so it's just important that we study each one.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, some animals, like we've seen squid and black sea bass, they'll react really strongly at first. You know, the squid will jet and change color and ink. But then after like the fifth, you know, impulse or so, it goes back to normal and they start schooling and mating. And, you know, they've got a very short life. They gotta, you know, make babies while they can. And so it doesn't phase them after very long.
They're like, I don't have time to think about this anymore. Must reproduce.
Not in immediate danger. Let's keep going.
Scallops, though. How are they detecting the sound? The scallops.
Yeah, so a couple ways. So they don't have ears. You know, if you've seen a scallop, you probably figured. But they do sit on the bottom. So you get a lot of this substrate-borne vibration too as the piles being hammered into the bottom, as well as the waterborne vibration that is, you know, propagates from the pile. And so they're receiving it kind of in their whole body as it vibrates a bit. And so they will close with each impulse. Every single one, they'll close, and then they'll start to open, and then they close again, start to open and close. And what we found with them is they don't habituate. So whether we play for 15 minutes, multiple 15-minute sequences, they'll keep doing that reaction, which is very energetically exhausting for them.
Right. So we have examples of how things are measured, and that's exciting. So show us what you got.
Okay, so these are sea scallops. These are the adults, so they're ginormous.
I was going to say, I didn't realize that they got that big.
Yeah, that's why they get fished a lot.
Okay.
And these are bay scallops, so they're
little.
little babies, and that's what we have around here.
I
mostly.
see. Okay, so the shells that everyone finds on the beach that they're obsessed with, those are scallop shells.
Yeah, bay scallops.
I knew they were a bivalve. I just wasn't able to identify the species.
Yeah. And so we put these little tags on them. They're an accelerometer, but they're also a magnetometer. So people use these for biologging, and they'll use the magnetometer to tell relation to Earth's magnetic field, which you've probably done a lot of.
I have indeed.
So you can know where they, you know, are oriented to. But if we put a magnet on their bottom valve, we can tell how far away it is, their top valve from their bottom valve. So then from that we can get valve angle, and then with the accelerometer we can detect each strike as it is received on their tag. So we can see the strike come in, or that, you know, impulse from the pile, and then we see them close.
Okay. Wait, so for the magnetometer, you'll have like a magnetometer on the bottom and then like magnets on the top or something? Or?
Reverse, yeah. Okay. So the little tag goes
top.
on top, and then the magnet just gets glued on the bottom.
Right. So it's detecting that, like, that change in the magnetic field, being close to the magnets and then farther away from the magnets, so that you can see like how much it's opening. And that's really cool.
Cool, huh?
Yeah.
I know.
That's so awesome.
I think so too.
Also, we love shells. I've got a couple shells. They're in that
around
jar.
Yeah.
It's a jar that used to have queso in it. You know, reduce, reuse, recycle, I guess. I don't know. So what about our flounder guys? Because I love them.
Yeah, so that was really sort of this past year's challenge, where we want to study more benthic animals that sit on the bottom, really receive that substrate-borne wave. Right. And flounder are a huge fishery along here.
Right.
They're one of the most popular commercial and recreational fish, but they don't have too many different behaviors. If you've ever looked at a flounder, when it's like happy and it's, you know, it's feeding, it'll sit on the bottom and hide. It's an ambush predator, so it sits there and waits. And when it's scared,
it sits on the bottom and
hides. And it's very good at camouflaging.
Creature of habit.
So in our, you know, crystal clear New England waters, a camera doesn't give us a whole lot of information about it. So we had to get a little creative. So what we did was we took these same accelerometer tags and put it on their operculum. So the operculum opens, and since they do lay on the bottom, they're a really good candidate for that because they lay there. And when they breathe, the operculum has this nice little wave of acceleration that we can then get respiration rate from.
Yeah. For those that don't know, the operculum is like the gill opening of the fish that moves.
Yeah, it like protects those gills, and every time it pumps water into it, you see it open and close. And so we put tags on their operculum, and then we can also, from that tag data, get when they're swimming. We can get startles from that. So we do see like some startles in response to the sound.
Yeah.
And then also, you know, an increased respiration rate due to the impulsive sound.
So they just start hyperventilating because I got scared.
A little bit, yeah.
It's like all those movies, like a horror movie where they're like hiding in the closet and they're like,
Yeah.
and I'm like, the murderer's gonna hear you. Like, what are you doing? That's what it made me think of.
Yeah, something like that.
I would love to see some of these tags be used to study flounder gill ventilation more, because I have worked with some people who study like their gill ventilation. Fish have this bone like within their like face, neck area around their gills called the urohyle. And usually it's like a flat plate, but for flat fishes, it's kind of like a U-shaped. And the idea is that they're able to kind of pump water through that between their gill chambers to fluidize the sand so that they can bury easier, which is really cool. And so I would love to see what kind of accelerometer and magnetometer data would come out of looking at what's going on with their gill arches as they're burying. That would be really cool. So if you're out there and if you've got funding to research flatfish breathing, go for it. So offshore wind, we love it, but we're understanding how it's impacting different wildlife so that we can try to mitigate those effects. Do you know of any current efforts and like what those efforts are to try and mitigate effects on, I don't know, black sea bass or the scallops or anything like that?
Most of the mitigation efforts so far have been in response to whales.
That is so
big
fair.
concern. But, you know, the benefits propagate down to the other animals too, as they're trying to reduce like the noise output into the environment. So it's pretty common practice to have bubble curtains now. So they'll put bubbles, a ring of bubbles, and pump air through. That air-water interface is really good at disrupting the sound waves and dissipating a lot of that energy.
I never even thought of that. That's so cool.
Yeah. So that's actually like pretty well used now, and it really keeps the sound from propagating too far into the environment.
Is it just like cut the propagation in half or anything like that? If you don't know, that's fine.
I don't know, and I also don't know what it does to the substrate vibration, because that is still would be beneath the so I'm not actually sure how much it would affect our benthic friends as much. So that's definitely something we should look into and explore for the benthic species. Other mitigation techniques, this one we have tested and tried, and we're still working up the data, is like a ramp up start or like a slow start. So, you know, they start with just the hammer dropping that far and then that far, and it gets slightly louder. So like the bigger the distance, the louder the bang. So it starts a little softer, and then they work up to the full impact sound. And this allows animals that can swim to get away, kind of gives them a heads up that it's starting to move out of the area. Or with, you know, like our squid that only react to the first 5 strikes. Potentially, if with this slow start, we're hoping that maybe we can eliminate that reaction completely, and they just will be adjusted to it and okay with it. Okay, that's really cool. What a sound that was. Now I want to talk about coral reefs, because everyone loves coral reefs. Coral reefs are wildly important for the ecosystem. There are statistics saying that about 25% of all marine life is dependent on coral reefs for their survival in one way or another. So clearly, without coral reefs, the ocean is going to suffer. And not only that, but they're important for mitigating damage to our coastal communities from like storm surges or like coastal erosion and things like that. So for both the ocean and for humans, coral reefs are important for all of these different reasons. So we've seen this huge decline in corals recently because of coral bleaching and habitat destruction, basically just us not being as kind to the ecosystems as we should be, which makes me quite sad. But this is why we have people that are trying to better understand how we are negatively affecting them so that we can try to improve our relationship with the ocean and our coral reefs. So I'm sure you've seen in the news a couple times at least
all these headlines of they're tricking baby corals into settling in the right place, or memes of like they're gaslighting the baby corals, which I think is very funny and also like not entirely inaccurate. So this was our friend Nadej Aoki's research. And can you tell us a bit about why are we gaslighting the baby corals?
And today I'm going to gaslight you into believing that it's for their own good.
I agree with you.
A big issue as the corals are declining through a number of reasons is that there's less larvae in the water column, and then there's less area for it to settle, or that it chooses to settle on. And so it's kind of like a cascading problem of, as these reefs are declining, there's not larvae coming in to replace them or try to build them back, even if the habitat might now be better if it was just wiped out by a storm, or maybe the pollution has been fixed on this reef. How do we start to let those recover and give them a chance? Mm-hmm. And so a really cool tool is sound, and coral larvae are actually sensitive to sound. They'll orient towards sound, and then in our lab we've showed that they'll settle in higher rates when exposed to healthy reef sound. So it has a distinct signature. It's something I've studied quite a bit, and there's a lot more fish calls and low frequency sounds in healthy reefs as they provide more habitat for fish. Mm-hmm. And we think that the larvae are actually using this cue to determine where they might want to settle, because they're going to stay there for the rest of their life. It's a big decision.
For anyone that might not know, corals obviously sit, and they're sessile. They sit on the ocean floor, but in their larval stage, they're like these little planktonic guys, and they're just kind of squirming around the water column, and they have to find a place to settle to then be sessile and sit there for the rest of their lives. But the problem is then, if there's not any healthy reef sounds, we don't hear fish calling. And yes, fish do produce sounds in a number of different ways. If they're not hearing all of these like healthy reef sounds of like, oh, it sounds like a party over there. I want to be over there, right? If it's just like, oh, it sounds like a really creepy, like abandoned park or something. Like, I don't want to go over there. Right. So it's the same kind of idea. So trying to get these corals to settle, even though maybe it's not the healthiest reef and there's not a lot of wildlife there at the moment, but could potentially be a healthy reef again because the ecosystem may support it. But we just have to get them to settle there. And that's why they're gaslighting the baby corals to say, hey, I know you might not think that it's the best spot to settle. I promise it's fine. And you're doing that by basically collecting sounds from healthy reefs and then playing them on not so healthy reefs.
Yep. Yeah, we have recordings. So our lab has been recording down in St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, since like 2012. Mm-hmm. And so we're actually using recordings from our healthy reef there from 2013 when it was much healthier.
Yeah.
And so that's probably that's why it's so important to, maintain these records of sound, is because that changes over time and everything as well.
So you're playing sounds from reefs in like 2013, and I just imagine these little baby corals being like, ooh, throwback. Yeah. My dad used to listen to this music.
The 2013 to 2015 age was the best club music, so.
Yes. I would venture maybe even 2016, but I'm getting 2012 was like 8th grade. 8th grade through high school jams, bro.
Yeah.
So the baby corals are getting some throwbacks, and it seems to be helping. So.
Yeah, and it's really important that we fix those root causes of why the reefs are declining, or else it won't do any good to lure them to a bad place. But it gives hope that if we can fix some of these warming and pollution problems, that we will be able to, on a scalable level, restore coral reefs. Because right now the restoration efforts of outplanting and little propagations is very time intensive, personnel intensive, and it's not really scalable right now.
Yeah, I would imagine if you've got reefs all over the world that need help, and you have people individually going and basically planting corals to be like, oh, let's hopefully help this reef. You can't do that all over the world. Like you said, tons of time and effort and people needed to make that happen. So if you're just like, here, let's play some nice reef sounds for them, and hopefully they'll come hang out over here. That's a much more I guess, yeah, like you said, scalable, a much more feasible solution. And of course, it's not a fix-all, like you said. It is a helpful part of the solution, but we also need to be, again, mitigating, the amount of pollution that we're putting in the ocean and like the coral bleaching due to climate change and elevated CO2 levels in the ocean and in the atmosphere. Because if you get them to settle somewhere, but there's still a ton of pollution, that coral's going to die. So we need to make it a livable environment for them and then trick them into thinking that there's already a ton of corals there so that they can kind of, start the next generation of wonderful corals hanging out in that area. So
yeah, almost like reverse this cascade and leverage their own, abilities to find places to settle and reverse it so that these reefs get repopulated and they don't just end up, getting blown offshore.
Yeah.
They end up somewhere that people will care about them and hopefully care for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love that. So you have a little example here of what is this?
So these are, so we've been measuring settlement with the sound treatments. And so this is a common way that people measure wild settlement of corals. They put these tiles down and the coral larvae will settle on them. So they have these nice little ridges because they like to get in the little cracks and crevices and hide so they don't just get mowed down by snails or
I was going to say, so like a super flat surface is not
they don't tend to settle on the flat side. And so we're going to be using some of these to measure wild settlement of larvae with sound treatment this summer in Hawaii.
Nice.
And then to do it in really controlled, just to isolate the sound effect, we'll use like cups. Little pea cups.
And if you've ever been to the gynecologist, you know what these cups are.
And so we put highly filtered seawater so it takes away any chemical cues. And then we'll put a settlement surface in there with a known amount of larvae so that we can really isolate the sound cue. And they do, as we put these farther on a gradient away from the speaker, they'll settle less and less. Quickly.
So the closer they are to the healthy reef sounds, the more likely they are to settle.
Yep.
Oh, that's really cool. So yeah, this seems like a really useful piece of the puzzle to trying to figure out how do we restore our coral reefs?
Oh, it's such a brutal problem.
I know.
So
but this
sad.
is like some happy news. It's so nice to have
and it's working and we're scaling up and we're trying to get these instruments that will play back sound into the hands of like resorts and different nonprofits and people that are already doing restoration because tourism is a big part of a big industry around coral reefs and also like the fisheries that they bring in and stuff too. So a lot of people want to see them improved and it's just figuring out how.
Yeah, absolutely. So with all of this really awesome, fantastic, beautiful, amazing coral reef restoration work, what parts of it have you been involved in and which parts do you think are the most exciting, regardless of whether or not you've been involved in that part of it?
Okay, so when I came into the lab, they had done just done like the first experiment, the first trial of like, will the sound playback work? And so then when I came in, we continued this work. And so I've been involved with a couple more experiments around the sound playback.
Nice.
And I've been involved a lot more with also on the other side using sound to like diagnose reefs and to monitor reefs. And that's something that I found really interesting and cool too. And I've done a lot more work on and about figuring out like what makes a healthy reef sound like a healthy reef.
Right.
And it's interesting to know what these, coral larvae might be cueing into, what we might be hearing and making us think like, oh, there's a lot of fish here, and using sound, to see changes in the environment, to detect, declining reefs or find more reefs based off of soundscape and exploration.
We love to think that marine biology is like just field work and diving all the time, but it is a lot of computer work too. But you do a lot of diving.
I'm very fortunate I get to do a lot of diving.
Yeah, so where have you been to go diving? And what are like the best and the not so healthiest reefs that you've seen?
A lot of my diving has been on less healthy reefs.
Yeah. The Caribbean's not doing so hot.
Caribbean is not doing so hot. We're trying our best down there, but I used to live down in the Virgin Islands and worked as a dive master, and now I get to go back and dive a lot of those same reefs, and we come in and check them every year, every 6 months, and so we've seen them go through bleaching event and try to recover, and then bleaching event again, and so that's really heartbreaking. But in the Pacific, where it tends to be a little deeper and a little cooler, they are doing pretty well.
Okay, that's good.
And so I'm excited to see more in the Pacific. I've, dove in Hawaii like once or twice, but not for field work.
Yeah.
And so we are expanding and trying to study Pacific species, seeing what they respond to. The Red Sea is another interesting one that I would love to dive.
I want to go there so bad.
Even warmer than like our Florida reefs, and they're amazing. Like there's so much coral. They're so healthy and alive, and they've just like grown this resistance to heat that is like wonderful.
I feel like, is it partially because like that place has always been pretty warm, and like now we're seeing the Atlantic is warming, especially the Northwest Atlantic up by Cape Cod, Canada, Gulf of Maine region is warming faster than pretty much anywhere else in the ocean. I feel like the Red Sea has always been, it's in the Middle East, so that's always been like a pretty warm area. So maybe it's just the rate at which it's warming is not quite as dramatic.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think, you hope that corals will adapt if we can just like slow the rate of what they need to adapt to. Like there is heat tolerance in certain species, and it's just whether they can adapt in time, to the warming climate.
I did a project in undergrad that was basically looking at drought resistance in trees, or not necessarily drought, but more like fire resistance in trees. And so basically I just like took tree cores and I was counting back. Okay, I know there was a fire this year, and seeing all of these trees and looking at like the distance between their growth rings, how much did they grow during certain years? And I kind of found that like some of the trees were resistant to, not entirely, but like resistant to fire and drought to a certain extent, and they were able to kind of get through those really hard times of drought and fire. And so it's just kind of like the same idea of there were a lot of trees that died off during those events, but a lot of trees survived. And so if we can kind of slow the effect of climate change and like the acidification of the ocean, that will give corals the chance to adapt and acclimate to these rising temperatures. And some of them, of course, will die. We're seeing that happen right now. But it'll at least, if it's not happening at such a dramatic rate, it'll give them the chance to adapt at least a bit to some of those rising temperatures.
Definitely not too late for corals.
Yeah.
If we can make some change now, like they can still survive.
Yeah. I always say it's never too late until you're dead. So
fight
the good fight until the very end, always.
Yeah.
And that applies for a lot of things. I mostly say that to people when they're like, oh, I feel like I'm falling behind and it's too late for me to chase my dream to be a marine biologist. I'm like, it's not too late until you're dead.
Nope.
I've seen people restart and go to undergrad in their 50s because they're like, I actually hate being an accountant and I want to do something fun. That's fine. Do that.
Marine biology is so fun.
Yeah. It's lit. Well, it was really cool to learn a bit about how our clean energy is potentially impacting some ocean wildlife and the efforts that we're making to learn more about those impacts and try and mitigate those impacts. But it was even more fun to learn about the hope that we still have for the coral reefs around the world. So thank you so much for giving us some good news in a sea of chaos and horrors every day, it seems. But there's hope for corals. There's hope for all of us. So that was a very lovely lesson to learn. So thank you, Sierra.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
that was awesome.
Is there anywhere that people can kind of like follow along with your science journey or with your lab's science journey or anything like that?
So our lab, Mooney Lab, you can find us under like Hui, and there's a website too. And then to follow along with some of our reef efforts. So it's not just sound that we're studying, although that's what I look at, but a whole bunch of us are trying to, integrate different data. So there's a reef solutions .hui Instagram that you can follow along and learn more about what's going on with that. So
amazing. Yeah. I am so excited to follow along with Reef Solutions and we get to see more hope for our coral reefs every time you look at that page. So you should go follow it. Amazing.
Very positive messages.
Heck yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us, Sierra. This was a lovely lesson. I hope that you had fun. I hope you learned something new. I hope you can go around telling all of your friends and family all of the hope that we have for coral reefs and clean energy. And as always,
have a great day.
And stay sharky, my friends. And then I always end it with like,
wow, I don't know why that sounded like my water bottle.
Yeah. You don't have to do that too if you
don't
want
know how
to
do that.